Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where real world worship leaders read real world. This sucks.
It's harder, isn't it?
I'm not doing it. I can't. This is
Hey, welcome to Real Talk, where we give real answers to real questions from real worship leaders. If you are a real worship leader with a real question and you want a real answer, head right here and submit your real question to a real form, and I will answer it with a real answer.
much better. That was great.
Got some good questions this week. Let's talk about it. What is your advice for navigating a system in which your theology differs significantly from that of the pastor? Or how much would your own theology have to differ from that of the pastor for you to consider stepping down and leaving the church? The church I lead worship at was Methodist but disaffiliated last July. They had an interim pastor until about February, then got a new pastor who comes from a Pentecostal charismatic background, whereas my own theology has become reformed over the last few years of my Bible study and research. I believe in Christian unity, so I've been giving him a chance, so to speak, but it is clear there is a significant theological divide between us. Though I do not agree with the pastor's theology and do not feel like his sermons spiritually feed me or my wife, as the worship leader of a newly disaffiliated church, working with a team of people I love, some of which are old friends, I feel a certain responsibility or obligation to stay, and I'm really struggling with this. Thanks so much for your time and advice. Please pray for me and the church. So the question is, I've been leading worship at a church for a while. Our pastor left. We got a new pastor, and now that pastor has different theology than me. So this person's in a Methodist church. They have Reformed theology. A Pentecostal charismatic leaning pastor came in, and they're asking, what is enough to make me leave a church? Which, man, I feel like we keep asking this question in different contexts, like, should I leave my church?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I feel like this question leans more heavily into what we were talking about, like reasons to leave your church. Like, do I not agree on the foundational principles, which is what we always talk about. Right. So I think we have to talk about, are they disagreeing on foundational principles or not?
Yeah, my first thought is my heart goes out because this sounds like something where they are very invested. They have long life friends. It seems like people, they've been at this church. This church has went through a transition, and now something out of their control has brought someone else in who is further from where they're even heading in a trajectory. I think those are pretty go in the opposite direction. You know, like Reformed theology versus Pentecostal charismatic stuff. And so my heart goes out. That's what I want to say is like, oh, that is a tough situation. I would not want to be in that situation. I think kudos for wanting to stay around and have the like pastoral care of those that you've already been invested in. I think that is the first best step. Like, as we have said several times in these videos, that up and leaving the church shouldn't be the first piece of advice. So now to answer the question, are they disagreeing? The theology that they disagree on, is it worth separating about? And we don't have specifics on that other than the generalities that come with those two schools of thought. And so, I don't know, what are your first thoughts? Real talk, man.
Yeah, I think, here's sort of the gauge that I would take in my mind. Because new pastors come into churches all the time. Mm-hmm. New pastors do not always stay in churches all the time. Mm-hmm. So my first thought is, it would really stink if you say, I've had enough of it with this pastor, and you leave, and then a year later you find out that pastor's not even there, and you could have stayed at the church. Yeah. That would be bad. And you know what? That kind of happened to me whenever I left my last church. I left because of certain things happening with the pastor. And then come to find out, 2 months later, he wasn't even there because other people had problems in the church as well. And so it's like, I could have stayed at that church if I would have just, and obviously hindsight's always 20/20. I made the decision I made at the moment. But I would just gauge and think like, is this pastor actually going to be at my church long term? Because, and I think you have to ask, like, not just what is your theology personally, what's your leaning, but what's the leaning of your church? Because if your church is leaning Reformed, and and this new pastor came in, if your church is like heavily Reformed, a charismatic Pentecostal pastor, which if that's the case, I'm not sure how they got hired in the first place, because nobody asked them about their theological understanding, and then they would have seen that this wasn't a good fit. So I'm not sure where your church is.
It doesn't sound like it, because they said they have become more reformed through personal study. In the question, it sounded like.
Yeah. So
I want to say to that, just my experience with Reformed theology and the Reformed and reckless or restless and Reformed group, sometimes that can lead us to where we feel like we are completely right and then everything else is not. And so this might be, just saying this, it could be a time of testing for you to have this truth that you know to be true, that you believe is true, but you need to grow in that, and God might be putting people in your life to help form you and fill you out, to challenge certain areas. You mentioned not being fed, but you are also in leadership. So there is this tension where you're fed, but you might not be fed by his sermons, but you might be fed in other ways through this gathering of believers. And so if I don't think I'm saying here, it would not be enough for me to leave a church just because I didn't feel fed by all the sermons, because there are plenty other ways within the life of the body of the church to feel fed, and we are also self-feeders, right? So
yeah, I'll say it like this way, I don't think am I being fed is necessarily the root issue that I would have, although I think that is a consideration, because that's something that we want out of our pastor's preaching. But I think the bigger consideration is is this pastor preaching and then I'm just not agreeing with everything they're saying, on a foundational level, not they said something and I was yeah, it might be interpreted that way in the Bible, but I think it's interpreted this way. For instance, the view on end times or something. If you're talking about the millennial kingdom, and you find out your pastor is an amillennialist, and you're if you're reformed, well, if you're actually reformed, you're probably post-millennialist, but some reformed people are premillennialists. So
some are also. I was
yeah, I don't know. Whatever. My point is, if you're traditionally reformed, you're post-millennialist.
Yes.
But regardless, my point is, if your pastor's preaching on that, and you're I disagree on that. I think it has been pretty well established that the millennial kingdom is a secondary topic, not something that we don't need to, or not something that we need to divide over. Yeah. So if it's things like that, and I say that to you because you probably know what I'm talking about, if you're I'm into Reformed theology, then you can handle that theological talk. Some people are just showing up to your church and they're just happy that somebody
smiled at them
speaking. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, think about those in terms of what is the primary issue, and then what are the primary issues of the faith, and then what are secondary issues and tertiary issues, and maybe some of those secondary issues are still concerning to you. There's secondary issues that I would have in churches that I would be this doesn't mean that you aren't saved, but it does mean I don't want to be a part of your church because I don't think that you're acting in a biblical way. That biblical way doesn't affect your salvation, but I disagree with it, and I'm not going to be a part of a church that I disagree with.
The problem is when it comes to having those three categories, but then people disagree on what goes in those categories or not. But the question said that the pastor is consistently taking verses out of context, and I want to say I don't know how old you are, how old the pastor is, but I've made mistakes before, and unknowingly, even more recent than I would like to admit sometimes, and have been called out and shaped by those. And I'm I didn't even think about that. And so I'm glad someone didn't give up on me. And so this pastor, even though he is the pastor, might still, have some rough edges and still need to be formed. And you might be the person to even help that, unless it's not that kind of situation. And this is just, you're going in two completely different directions. So what would we say then?
Yeah, so here's the worst case scenario that I can imagine. Okay, you're Reformed worship, which I would challenge you and say, are you actually Reformed worship? Because a lot of people think that they're Reformed worship, but they're still acting Charismatic Pentecostal worship way, where we have long worship sets and stuff. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I'm just saying, Reformed worship is a very specific thing. You probably have a liturgy that you're going through or something. So I say that because worst case scenario is, I believe, as the worship leader, as somebody in charge of the worship ministry at this church, I fundamentally believe that worship should be done this way. in a let's go like super hardcore, like in a liturgical style where we are if you're in the Reformed camp, I'll say a covenant renewal worship service where when we come, we are reenacting the gospel during our worship service. And so we're going to start with a call to worship. We're going to see the glory of God. We're going to recognize our sinfulness, confess our sinfulness, hear the word preached as if Jesus is calling us to him. And then we are going to share in communion because we are participating in the feast that we are invited to. And then we are sent out missionally. Like, that is a super reformed way of doing worship, as opposed to, okay, my pastor comes in now and he wants me to have these long times of spontaneous worship. People have flags in their worship service. People are, and once again, I'm going extreme here. Not everybody is like this, but people are running around the aisles. We've got people speaking in tongues all over the place, maybe laughing on the floor with holy laughter, right? Like, I'm showing you the two extremes here. If you're on one extreme and your pastor's on the other extreme, I would probably not stay in that church any longer, whether I am in the charismatic Pentecostal camp and my pastor is Reformed, or I'm Reformed and my pastor is Pentecostal. So I think you just have to think, like, how big is the gap? I think that is the question that you need to answer, and then wait a little bit, because like I said, if your pastor isn't going to be a good fit at your church, then you don't want to leave that church and then be like, the pastor is not even there anymore.
No, I agreed. And then I'm just, my mind's going to what is the pastor's thoughts, or is he like not really thinking about it? It seems like maybe this person's feeling like they're not even thinking about it. They're just doing their thing. They're taking Bible verses out of context. It sounds like this person's a deep thinker, and so this. You will have to decide if these things are strong enough for you to leave those people who you are currently shepherding and committed to and friends with. Is this big enough of an issue? Or can you choose to stay and not live in a state of frustration? Like, just say, I know that this is my assignment. Maybe I'm unclear. And so instead of leaving, I'm going to stick it out for 6 more months and pray that I do not live in a state of frustration and serve well and see how God leads you. But don't stay knowing I'm going to be frustrated. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't stay to be a thorn in someone's flesh or to let it build more bitterness in your heart.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, I'm not sure how long this pastor has been there for, but, like, I'm not going to leave, like, right away when a new pastor joins. I'm probably going to stick around for, like, a year and just see how things...
I just want to watch the circus, you know?
Maybe. But I want to see how things play out. You know, like, your pastor's probably not going to make a bunch of changes in the first 6 months that they're there. Hopefully they don't. If they do, I mean, they can, I guess. But I don't know. Then you'll find out faster what decision you should make. But I'm probably sticking around for a year at least to just kind of feel it out. So don't rush to the decision, but think carefully about what's important to you and what's not important to you.
I'm having issues with leadership not agreeing with my standards, namely punctuality, practice mandatory, music ability. Am I wrong for not compromising? Our team is small, as is our congregation. I want to build a strong, effective team and feature leaders with a solid foundation.
So I imagine somebody downloaded my code of conduct and they're like, I've implemented all of these things that Spencer said, and then my pastor comes to me and they're like, you can't do this. How dare you say that your worship team members should be on time? How dare you hold them to moral expectations because they're a leader in the church? That's the picture that I get in my head. Like, what are some of the things? Let's just talk about expectations on the worship team. Like, what are some, just, you know, you don't have to get super specific, but what are some expectations you have for your worship team members?
Well, I would say, first of all, expectations are needed. There's the example of, like, I heard an illustration of kids in a playground where there's a playground and they have all this property, but there's no fence. And so most of them just stay close to the middle. And then when there's a fence, most of them explore the whole area because there were guidelines, there were boundaries. And so there's freedom that comes with expectations. And so I like to remind people that. So I feel for the person who asked the question, and I would want the same thing. Second is that I'm thinking, like we've said in some other videos, I'm at my ministry as an assignment that God has given me, and I want to serve these people. And so there is a way, something about the question said, am I wrong for not compromising? Compromising might sound like you're compromising on your core beliefs about something. I would not do that, but excellence in worship, I don't think it's not a salvific topic. It's not, I wouldn't see this as compromising. It's wisdom in bringing people along, in discipleship and bringing people along. So I think there's maybe a little bit of rigidity in the question where I would say, I would want what you want, but I would maybe think about how long it might take for them to get there. And so expectations.
Yeah, I'm wondering if like your pastor maybe is seeing you moving too fast, because I get a lot of questions like this from people where they're like, my team's horrible, what do I do about it?
Yeah.
And maybe I have given this advice in the past, but it's probably not the right advice, and probably not the advice that I would give myself. Like if I'm in that situation, it's not like we're gonna strip this. Like I've been serving in this worship ministry for 10 years, and it's gotten to a point where people are always late and they're not prepared. And now I'm going to say, we're just stripping everything back. Everybody's off the team until you get this right. Like you've probably led your team there over 10 years or 5 years or whatever it's been. Like you're not going to fix the problem in 1 month just by saying the expectations that you wish that you have. So I say that because maybe your pastor is seeing, and maybe they're not even communicating this, but maybe they're seeing that you're moving too fast and you're gonna like alienate all these people who were on the worship team who just don't, I mean, you think they should know better, but maybe they don't know better because that's just the culture that you've created. So I think it goes back to what Jimmy said about taking your time in it. Like we've got to, first of all, we do need expectations that we're going to hold our team to. And I always like to utilize like new seasons to reintroduce these ideas. So 2 new seasons that are the most obvious, and one of them is coming up as of me putting out this video, is like the fall season, right? Like
semester.
The fall ministry season is about to kick back in. School's going to be back in session for the kids, and something happens during that time where there's a transition season. So it's either that or it's the new year where it happens. And you say to your team, hey, listen, in this next season of ministry, we're going to focus on these things. And I want us to step our game up as a worship team. And I've identified some areas that I think that we can work on. And here is what I would like to bring to you for us to work on over these next few months. So this is what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be focusing on, I don't know, like pick one thing for the next 3 months. We're going to focus on learning our songs more. And then you don't just tell them, hey, you need to learn your songs better. But you're like, as part of that, I'm going to equip you to learn those songs better by giving you an MP3 that you can practice with. I'm going to give you an accurate chord sheet. I'm going to send out the songs 2 weeks in advance so that you can know them. And we're really going to focus on this thing, learning our songs, because it's going to shorten our rehearsals when we get together. Because now we don't need to learn the songs at rehearsal. So it's just like, see how I explained everything about this is the problem that I've identified. This is how we're going to work on it to solve it together. And this is the benefit that we're going to have. So it's not just, Jimmy, would you please, for the love of God, please learn your songs.
Show up on
What
time.
are you doing, right?
Yeah.
Like this is discipling. This is pastoring people.
So there's 2 things. And one thing I've learned that I was already doing, but Alex Infiegin put words to it in the audition phase. He said you want to establish like a coaching relationship with those on your team so that you are constantly the one who is bringing them along and you're not like responding and trying not to offend. And so I love that. This is when that has not been the case. And so I'm constantly, and this might be a personality thing, but I want people to trust me as I bring change. And so I will even bring myself along in the change rather than being like, here's what I want. Here are my standards that I'm not compromising on, and you guys need to come to this. I will bring them along, and I will share from my heart first. And so, like, I recently brought a change of singing a cappella, okay? Instead of just doing it, I explained why. And I was like, I feel like the importance of the singing in the corporate gathering is very important. And I haven't done a good job of doing that. I haven't done a good job. And so I'm bringing them along on how I'm growing as a leader, and I want to bring them along in that, and that works so well. with everything. When I wanted to bring on tracks, when we were transitioning to a track, or even using a click at first, I had some people who hated it because they were so unused to singing on time. I had some people who were professional musicians who felt disrespected that I thought that they needed a click. And I had to bring them along and say, I'm not even good. Like, I need a click. This is just an objective source, like, that we can all agree on. You as a professional musician, I know you don't need this, but we are on a team of not all. I had to just bring them along in it. That's what I'm trying to get at. So bringing people along, build trust, and take your time. Like he just said, pick one thing and then bring them along in that rather than just teaching them. But don't, there's a balance, because I just mentioned, like, remain that coach. And I think the way to be that coach is to bring them along, be transparent, share ways that you're growing, share ways that you want us as a team to grow together. I think that'll go a long ways.
And just to bring it back to the actual question, because we kind of strayed into, like, your pastor might be seeing this, and so this is what you should do with your team. I think you do the same thing with your pastor. And you say, listen, pastor, I've been really frustrated over, the past 2 years because my team never shows up on time, and it's like all of these problems come from that. And so, like, I would like to move towards having a strict starting time for our rehearsal, which I don't even know if I'm asking. I'm not, in my church, I'm not asking my pastor for permission for that. I'm just doing it. But maybe in your church you feel like you need to ask that. Like, we're going to have rehearsal at 6:30 on Wednesday nights, and at 6:30 we're going to start. And if you don't show up for rehearsal at all, then my expectation is that you're not going to be there on Sunday because I need you at rehearsal.
Yeah. And ask yourself, why do you want people to show up on time? And when you answer those questions, because you do have those answers, because obviously you want that, then share that with your team. So,
and with your pastor, if you feel like you have to explain it to him.
And I share it often so that it's not weird. Does that make sense? Like, I am constantly saying at the end of rehearsal when I'm leading it. Now, you were at rehearsal tonight, but I wasn't really leading it. But I'm like, hey, I'll see you Sunday morning, nice and early. Make sure, remember, and this is every week. I say, remember, sound check starts at 7:15, so you can't arrive at 7:15. You have to be able to put your in-ears in and have that done. And I say that, and I want to lead from a place. This is another thing I wanted to say earlier. I want to lead from a place of, like, joy and happiness in my ministry. I want to bring, because people catch on to that, but they also catch on to, like, leading from a place of frustration. So even if you're frustrated, that's your problem. Like, they may be frustrating you, but it's ultimately your leadership. So you have to get them there. And it may be a slow process, but you have to lead from a place of joy. Bring them in. I'd like to keep things more lighthearted than not, so that I can say things and it be, like you saw me, after rehearsal this past week, I just went up to people and I was like, hey, this needed a little work on. I was out here, I was hearing this. And they know who I am. I've built that trust. It wasn't weird for me to do that because I do that stuff all the time. If I never did that and I walked up to somebody and did that, they'd be like, oh, what's wrong with Jimmy this week? Or, oh, this must be serious. He finally came to me and said something. And so just be bringing people along all the time.
Yeah, I would put it this way, like, make it a normal routine. That way it's not reactionary.
Yes.
Because when you respond reactionarily, it's like somebody was late, so I need to say something next time. As opposed to, like, we're just going to work this into our normal vocab. Now, if you need a place to start with what expectations, if you're, like, second guessing your expectations for your team, I will give you my expectations for my team, and you can see what I tell my team they need to do. So I'll link that down in the description below. It is the Worship Team Toolkit. In that, I will give you the code of conduct that I give every new worship team member who joins my team. And not only do I give it to them, but I hold them to those expectations. So you can check that out down in the description below. I also have my application form that people fill out if they want to join my worship team. So check that out down there. Other than that, thanks so much for joining us today. Until we see you in the next video, keep leading worship well.